Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of our consecration of 9/11 and international peace. This is day 8, and beginning last Saturday, a week ago, we began our commemoration of 9/11, that extraordinary event that changed our world. And we're heading toward next Tuesday, the 21st, where we will consecrate world peace. And today we want to contemplate the issue of human rights. And I'd like to open our discussion in the following way. Just yesterday, there was an article in Vox magazine that summarized the catastrophic effect of 9/11. Altogether, there were $6 trillion spent by the US government on the two wars that emanated out of 9/11. An additional $2 trillion has been spent on the health of the returning vets for a total of $8 trillion. Over 900,000 people were killed. A fraction of those were American soldiers, but over 95% of everyone killed in those wars were either Afghanis or Iraq. The wars left those two countries completely decimated. Over 38 million people were displaced. And when you think of the populations of Afghanistan and Iraq, very small, you get a measure of what 38 million people being displaced. It was between 1/3 and 50% of the entire populations. Now, that's the devastation of those wars. But there was a collateral damage with the Patriot Act in the United States that was replicated in most countries around the world, as governments saw an opportunity to systematically abridge human rights. The Patriot Act in the United States passed within weeks of 9/11, almost as if they were prepared, which is an issue that I will get into tomorrow and Monday. The Patriot Act gave the government the right to wiretap or eavesdrop on any citizen in any of the media, phones, emails, social media. It gave the government the right to arrest without a warrant any citizen or foreign national. It gave the government the right to hold people without charges, a violation of habeas corpus, which has been in Western civilization for the last 1,000 years, since the Magna Carta back in 1205 in England. And it gave the government the right of search and seizure, to come into homes without a warrant and search and seize. I want to push this envelope of human rights to the contemporary day by saying that even as the governments around the world took advantage of 9/11 to systematically abridge our human rights, they're doing it today with COVID. And I think it's very important that all of us take in the systematic violation of human rights that is going on today around the world, as governments once again use a catastrophic event, in this case, a virus, to systematically lock us down, enforce social control, and now through vaccinations, developing mandates and an apartheid system that is giving our governments control over our personal lives and now our bodies in absolutely unprecedented ways. Never in history have governments interceded on our own bodies in terms of our health. And I want to underscore this because, as has been noted by no one less than Harari, the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, one of the great contemporary commentators of our time, who said that at the heart of the pandemic, deeper than health, is human rights. And the way our governments, like they did in 9/11, are systematically constructing the next stage of the national security state. I mentioned several days ago that 2020 set another world record in the number of activists that were murdered by the state and by major corporations around the world. And that's since 2015, according to Global Witness, on the average of 2 a week, activists have been killed by governments. So as we start this session today on human rights, let us all appreciate that human rights around the world at every level are under siege, are under attack. And we need to be aware that this is being orchestrated internationally by governments and international institutions. And it is incumbent on us as citizens, as activists, to understand this with ruthless realism, so that as we honor human rights activists today, we honor them not in a marginal or frivolous way. We honor them because they are seeking to protect the very foundation of democracy. Without freedom of speech, without freedom of the press, without freedom over our bodies, democracy is null and void, even if you have the right to vote. So human rights is the sacred cornerstone of virtually everything that we hold as precious in our societies. So as we begin our program today, in the midst of these issues that we need to contemplate, let us pause just for a moment. Let us enter the sacredness of our own bodies that are under siege. And let us take a breath, or breath-breathing human beings, said Rumi. The essential distillation of our humanity is that we are breath-breathing human beings. And let us align ourselves with our hearts. And just for the next 60, 90 seconds, let us center ourselves on our heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that we're alive at this moment. And we have the capacity to love all sentient beings. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to welcome my good friend and colleague, Rick Olphik, who, as you know, is one of the co-founders of 11 Days of Global Unity and founder of We the World. And since 2004, shortly after 9/11, has been convening these 11 Days of Global Unity. So Rick, thank you so much for everything you've done over these years. And I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And I also want to thank Rick Buckley, along with Ubiquity University and Humanity Rising, for broadcasting all of these 11 Days of Global Unity Summit panels and for offering the master's degree scholarships in peace and tolerance, as well as regenerative action for our volunteers and change agents that we are actually giving tribute to in these sessions each day. So thank you for offering that. And these scholarships are in honor of our dear friend, Avon Madison from Pathways to Peace for the 11 Days of Global Unity. As Jim said, my name is Rick Olphik. I'm the founder of We the World and the We campaign at we.net. And I'm the co-creator of 11 Days of Global Unity with my dear friend, Troy Lush. Yes, it is the 17th anniversary of 11 Days of Global Unity, going from September 11th through September 21st, the International Day of Peace. And we are in what some people call a peace weekend. So you can find out more about 11 Days of Global Unity, the broadcasts, partners, events, and everything by going to we.net. And we invite you to collaborate with us as a volunteer or an organization partner as well by going to we.net. So let's start with today's scholarship award. Jim, do you want to give an overview of these scholarships? And then we'll talk about the person who's receiving it today.
Yes, thank you, Rick. We wanted to help commemorate the 11 Days of Global Unity by offering scholarships to people that have been working so tirelessly and so heartfully to support 11 Days by giving them the opportunity to study with peers around the world in the area of regenerative action. We have a master's in regenerative action that has been unique in the sense that it's not offered just by Ubiquity University, but it's being offered by 40 or 50 organizations simultaneously around the world. If you think of a Wikipedia of regenerative action, where organizations are all coming together to contribute content, that is at the heart of our Masters in Regenerative Action. And then we have a similar one in tolerance and peace studies that's being developed by the Global Council on Tolerance and Peace, and academics from probably 20 or 30 countries. We have parliamentarians from over 75 countries that are bringing in students into the program. And we wanted to include some of the activists that are associated with We the World or 11 Days. So each day, Rick and Callum and others have selected deserving individuals. And we just want to appreciate what you're doing, Rick. And from our point of view, this is how we contribute to a better world.
That's great. Thank you, Jim. So today's scholarship recipient is Eric Nikorera Mana, who lives in Rwanda, and he is a community activist, passionate about living with vulnerable and disadvantaged families in order to create a better place for them where they can expose their potentials and bring a hope to the hopeless hearts. He loves to be at the center of impact creation through community engagement. And Eric is very grateful to Ubiquity University for this wonderful scholarship opportunity. And I think we have a video that Eric made. Is that correct?
Hello, my name is Eric Breman. I have a bachelor's degree in social sciences, specifically in history and heritage studies. Currently, I'm doing with my community, sensitizing them about how we can build peace and reconciliation about our social conflict, and in order to make peaceful society and a world that is safer from violence. After getting this opportunity of getting a master's degree in peace and tolerance from Ubiquity University in America, I will use that skills in reconstructing the people according to the history of our country, where the people were divided, and this led to the genocide. But as a result of that courses, I will try to bring them together and tell them how they can thrive in peace, free, without tolerance, with a full of tolerance and without the conflict, in order to make the world safer and a better place for everyone. Thank you very much.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Eric Nicorera Mana. And you know, I wanted to mention something about Rwanda, since Eric is in Rwanda. You know, one of our board members is someone that viewers may know about. Her name is Immaculée Ilibagiza. And Immaculée was one of the survivors of the Rwandan genocide. Immaculée was coming back from college when with her family, and her family was in the Tutsi group, the Tutsi tribe, the Tutsi group, and they were the ones that were being targeted by the Hutus. And her family said to her, you know, it's dangerous for you to be here. And they encouraged her to try to hide from what they saw as this burgeoning attack on the Tutsis by the Hutus. And so they had a friend, a Hutu priest, who actually took Immaculée in and hid her along with some other Tutsi girls, and they were all crowded into this priest's bathroom in his house. They thought they would just be there for a few days until the attacks, ended. They turned out they were in that bathroom for 91 days. And the priest who hid them in his bathroom, he had 10 children, and he didn't want to tell the children that these girls were in the bathroom there. So whenever he had dinner for his children, whatever they left on their plates, that's what he would bring up to these girls in this bathroom to protect them. And so they were, it was this incredible story. And she wrote this book called Left to Tell. And even 60 Minutes did a story on her. And 60 Minutes later, like 10 years later, they brought her back and got the other girls back together and went to that house where they were hidden and protected for 91 days. And of course, Immaculate's family was entirely killed by the Hutus. So one of the people who killed members of her family was in jail. And the 60 Minutes camera crew took Immaculate to the jail, and Immaculate talked to this person through the bars of the jail and said, "I forgive you," to this person. And anyway, this is Immaculate Ilibagiza, and she's got many charities going, and we're doing that with her, with We the World in Rwanda. She is, giving to, there's a school for autism there and many other charities. So I just wanted to mention that because, today we're talking about human rights, and since Eric is in Rwanda, I thought people might be interested to hear about that.
And Rick, before we go on, I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary diversity of the people that you're bringing in for scholarships. I mean, in terms of countries, Colombia and Botswana and Pakistan and Rwanda, you have an extraordinary reach, and it's really going to bring into the program a global cohort of diversity. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for it. Well done, my friend.
Well, thank you. That's what We the World is all about, right? It's our challenge to meet that title that we have for our organization, but let's do it, right? Because the idea is, if for us to meet these huge challenges that we have, like climate change and the mass extinction of species and poverty and militarism and all of these things, it's going to take people coming together from around the world to do it. So that's what we're all doing it for, right, Jim?
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Sure. So today, on our Day for Human Rights, we're excited to bring you our tribute to changemakers working on We the World's campaign, on all of our campaigns. And today we're going to focus on our human rights campaign. So I'd like to bring in Callum Cintron. Callum Cintron is the coordinator for We the World's campaign for human rights, with a focus on the LGBTQ+ community. And Callum is the human resources director for We the World as well. Callum leads the social media team for We the World. And Callum is also behind the scenes on all of these broadcasts, making sure things are going well technically, interacting with viewers, exchanging comments, and so many other things. And Callum does this all while Callum is going to school, if you can imagine that. So I and we are deeply grateful to you, Callum, and I'm so glad we're doing this tribute to you today. Welcome to the broadcast, Callum Cintron.
Thanks, Rick. So to start, I wanted to bring up what Jim said in the beginning. As a lot of people agree that there is a bit of a systematic social control and mandating over bodies with vaccines. But I wanted to point out that although there hasn't been complete societal expectations towards public health, as there is with the coronavirus affecting a majority of the populations, especially in the United States, there is definitely and historically has been social control over minority populations and historically underrepresented populations. So while white society and especially cisgender male society hasn't really been affected by it, public health and the health system has always systematically oppressed people, especially, like I said, underrepresented populations. Black women were forcibly sterilized so that they couldn't have children. Indigenous people still to this day face horrible health systems. Disabled people have been forcibly sterilized. LGBTQ plus people are denied health care. And especially controlling bodies, as we know, going on in Texas right now, there is the ban on abortions. And this is something that happens a lot. And I think COVID is a bit different, where it is to keep everyone legitimately safe and not through the eyes of white people thinking this could help either push the white population further, or they think they are helping these underrepresented populations when they actually aren't. So it definitely has been happening all through history, not on the scale that it's happening right now. And then, of course, with COVID right now, a lot of the underrepresented populations are not being helped adequately to keep them safe. Vaccine rates aren't as high in those populations, not only due to lack of access to getting, either they can't get a car ride, take the subway, train, bus, whatever, to a vaccine site, but also that there is a lot of intergenerational trauma around healthcare systems for those communities. A lot of lack of trust in those communities, because when they do go to healthcare systems, they're not believed for just because of either their race, who they are, who they identify as. Um, like I said before, they can even be denied healthcare. Transgender people are denied healthcare just for being transgender, or receive worse healthcare. So there's a lot of lack of access to keep those communities safe, and they're also not getting PPE, protective equipment. Indigenous communities aren't receiving the help that they need, and they're already um, very overrun and understaffed because of funds. Healthcare systems, they can't really access the true help that they need for their keep the population safe from COVID, and the government's not really helping them out there. So COVID has been a really big human rights issue, just perpetuating historical trauma and lack of access in the healthcare systems. Um, and the United States is definitely not doing the best job at COVID altogether, but it's not helping that those communities who are already being affected in numerous other ways aren't getting the help that they need. Uh,
Yep, thank you. And so since we're kind of looking at you and your story today, Callum, what would you say has led you to be thinking about this and expanding your circles of caring to include others and whole communities, as you've been doing? Not everybody does that. A lot of people are just focused on themselves, their careers, their own lives, their own health and all of that. But you have kind of expanded your interests. And why do you think that happened? I mean, when you were growing up, was that kind of expansive thinking encouraged in your family, or was it some families it's the exact opposite, and kids kind of rebel against their parents, and they go in a direction. What's your story?
Yep. So I think one of the main things is I'm a big animal lover, wildlife, and all that. And protecting wildlife is really important to me. And I've just realized that no one's going to help wildlife and animals if they're not even willing to help other people. So that's a big part of why I've started focusing on human rights. Um, but growing up, there was never really discouragement or encouragement. Where I live up in Northwest New Jersey, which is the traditional lands of the Munsee Lenape, we have I'm up in a county called Sussex County, and growing up, I definitely had less of a white community. There was always a lot of my friends were people of color, and that was just kind of how reality was to me. I never realized that there was a societal difference between people that society has created. So for me, there wasn't really a difference, and I didn't grow up in a predominantly white area like a lot of people I know. So I think being able to be around other cultures and people was just a different upbringing for me than people who just grow up in a white area with white norms. And then in college is when I'm an anthropology major, and I started realizing there were all of these historical and current oppression against different communities that we were never taught growing up. I'm only 23, but I was never taught Indigenous history, Black history, of course, not LGBTQ plus history. I wasn't talked. We weren't told about disabilities of any kind. Um, and where I live, the best way I can describe the culture here is if you whisper it, it's not racist. People think that if they talk in a hushed tone, um, and it's only white people around, then what they're saying isn't racist. And I just never understood that and why those ideas existed. And as someone who really likes to understand the why, I started doing my own education to figure out why what people were doing is wrong. Um, and then through my studies of anthropology, at first I was a forensic anthropology student where I was focusing on human decomposition and post-death things. And even then, race was brought into it. One of the ways people's bodies are identified when it is just a skeleton, one of the methods is identifying race, which it sounds like it's hard, and it is. There is no clear cut way to identify someone's race through their skeleton. And just the racist history of anthropology was baffling to me, that this field that could have done so much good with the methods and tools it had just destroyed cultures and communities even more. And then I was on medical leave for a bit, and I started doing my own work on racism and reading and stuff like that. And then um, I had only thought I was only going to be sick for a little bit. The doctors kept telling me that, oh, we'll figure it out in 3 months. You'll be back to school. But now it's 3.5 years later, and I'm still chronically ill. And it just made me start looking in for my personal experiences about what is happening in these communities. And of course, like all other white people, last year when George Floyd was murdered, I started upping my work in anti-racism and diversity, equity, inclusion work. Um, but unlike most other white people, I didn't stop when what they saw as the fad was over. And it's just been important to me that these communities that did nothing to deserve any of this are so oppressed in a society, especially when combined, these three communities make up almost 70% of the US population, and yet they're seen as minorities and less than. And just doing this work to try to raise the voices of these community members so that people can hear actual experiences. I think through my work, I've noticed that white people, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied people think there's one narrative for all BIPOC, LGBTQ plus disabled people, and don't realize that not only does every community have their own story, but every individual person has their own story. And I think it's important for people to hear these stories so that they can understand what's going on and how they can help, or just understanding a different experience. White people don't, and cisgendered and heterosexual able-bodied people at least don't have to jump in as the savior and help. You can just learn and understand, and be empathetic with people. It's not all about you coming in and being the hero at the end of the day. And that's something important to me, that people don't just look up statistics and believe those statistics, especially with academia and all those related fields still being centered in white supremacy, that people get to hear the actual stories of people who aren't consulted during those research works, and that the data that they're generally not consulted on, so that it is coming from a personal experience and not someone outside of the community acting as if these people are just numbers on a page.
Right. Definitely. And, you know, I also wanted to express additional appreciation to what you've been doing, because as you indicated, you do have a chronic health situation going, and you're still doing all of the amazing things that I mentioned before and that people really appreciate. So I'm wondering, you know, where is that superhero cape that I think belongs on your back? I think you left it off for this broadcast. I don't know why. So, but also I wanted to ask you, since you're majoring in anthropology, and you talked about some of the kind of racist roots of anthropology, do you think that it is starting to shift a little bit in the field? Are the subjects of racism, hierarchy, and oppression, are those part of what is taught in when you're learning anthropology these days?
I think it depends on the institution. I go to Oregon State via their eCampus program, and I found that Oregon State is a very well-rounded institution that does teach about power and privilege and these different communities. One of our general education requirements is called discrimination and power. So you have to take a course on something that's like transgender politics, history of racism in the United States, and stuff like that. And I think it definitely depends on the institution. There are still many institutions in the United States in higher education that are very focused in white supremacy and the patriarchy, and still don't necessarily teach those things. I do not think anthropology is still out there talking about how we as a field can help colonize people, but like every other aspect of society today, the racism and colonial ideology and other topics are more in a hush tone. And I just think in general, no matter how we are being taught in the institution, the field of anthropology itself has a lot of reconciliation to do. That there are countries and communities out there in the world that refuse to have an anthropologist come in. They don't want them there. They don't care what has happened to the field of anthropology now. There's just so much trauma there, intergenerational trauma, that it's surpassed the point of being able to reconcile. And I think anthropology needs to be okay with that, just like every other aspect of higher education. If a community does not want you there, especially if you are not part of that community, then you don't go there. It's not really a debate for you to have and try to talk people into letting you into their community. Don't talk about like the benefits of what could happen. I think anthropology could be a very good field, especially in cultural anthropology. The research method typically used is called ethnographic research, which is when you go and you do participant observation. So, say you are looking into public health in a Black community. You would go in and talk to the health services there. You would do research on the health services that are being offered. You would physically go and talk to the community members. And it's a little bit different than other interview styles. You're not going to go in there and have a list of questions. You might have guiding questions, but it's for them to talk freely. And it's more about, like I've been saying, those personal experiences and having those heard. And I think that could do a lot for racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and everything in the United States. But again, a lot of those communities just don't want us there. When I make my research proposals, I did a research project for my research course this past winter on the first year of transmasculine transitions. And although I am a part of that community, it does not mean I get to come in as a research person in that community. So every place that I was trying to get participants from, I would send them my written project proposal and release forms and answer any questions. And something I personally do is acknowledge that anthropology has been a field that is racist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, and that it is perfectly okay if they do not want to interact with me because I am an anthropology student or an anthropologist. And thank them for their time if they don't want to interact with me, and ask if I can offer them any other services, which I am able to do with my connections through working with We the World and other organizations. I just let them know that I have those, that I can connect them to people. And like I said, I thank them for their time and kind of move on. So even if an academic field, especially anthropology, sociology, political science, biology, is moving in the right direction, if they aren't reconciling for the past and trying to just move on to a better future, as if the past doesn't affect the field today, then it's kind of wasted efforts, because we can't just pretend that what our academic fields didn't happen.
All right. Well, that sounds great that you connect with them in that way, which is hopefully non-threatening to them. And so they realize that at least you are coming from a place of empathy and support for what has been historical trauma really in their communities. So, and I'm wondering, you mentioned that idea about trying to determine the race of a person from their bones. And that's, so there's a lot of stuff in there. This idea that the concept of race is a construct of people making an interpretation about things as opposed to a scientific, analysis. It's, so maybe as an anthropology major, maybe you can answer that question. Some people, I've heard it said that scientifically speaking, there is no such thing as race. And yet, sometimes you hear things like lupus is more in certain, communities, maybe African-American communities and that kind of thing. And so I'm wondering what the reality is there. And if it is true that there is scientifically no such thing as race, is that something that is explicitly said now in the field of anthropology?
Yep. So there's always going to be someone who figures out how to take some little piece of data to prove that race is biologically real. So a majority of things in our life are socially constructed. Our language is socially constructed. There is no actual reason we call a tree. So of course there is you can go through the Latin roots and stuff, but there's no, why are those Latin roots there? Everything is pretty much arbitrary. And race, while it's important to acknowledge that although race is a social construct, it has legitimate consequences. So a lot of people hear social construct and think that it's just something made up like a unicorn. But societal constructs in human society have legitimate consequences. And while there is no biological way to say races exist, there is a really good book. I cannot think of who the author is, but I believe it's called Everyone is African, and talks about how human life as Homo sapiens started in Africa. We migrated out to Europe and then Asia and then across to the Americas. And it talks about genetics in there, but not in a you need to know biology kind of way. It's a very easy way to understand genetics. And even if there are some words you have to Google, it's very reader friendly for most people. But there is generally in such a small number of genetic differences between races that it essentially doesn't exist and is not statistically or biologically usable. There's actually more genetic difference inside communities than there are between communities, and communities here I mean races. But so there's going to be more genetic differences between indigenous tribe in Africa than there are between people who are considered Black and people who are considered white. And another point of proving it's a societal construct, something I read once that has really stuck with me is it was about an African woman who came to the United States. And I believe she was living in the United States. And for her whole life, she was never considered Black living in Africa. She had never heard that terminology in Africa. And I don't recall if it said where she was in Africa, but I'm assuming not South Africa, where there is more of a white population. But she was never considered Black, and then all of a sudden she came to the United States and she was Black, and all of a sudden all these new categories and all had all of these different types of oppression against her now. That all she did was move to a different country. Nothing else changed about her. So the fact that where human life as Homo sapiens began in Africa, there is not really the concept of being black outside of what colonizers have brought there. But then they go to a country that was not where Homo sapiens began, and there is this concept of being black and being oppressed. So there is no legitimate biological, in humans at least. Of course, they're called species generally, but races in other animals, but we don't have that. There isn't enough genetic difference between us. And of course, like I said, people are going to find that one little piece of science to prove it. So when we were talking about skeletal structures before, when you look at the difference between white and a black skeleton, there might be differences. So on a black skeleton, the nasal cavity is generally wider, but there are regional reasons why, and it's not based on race. So it might be because the person who is black or Middle Eastern is in an arid area, so they need a wider nasal cavity to bring in more air and deal with the moisture and humidity. But it's not because they are black, it is because where they live requires this body modification to survive. It is the same thing with skin color. People have darker skin because they need protection against the sun. When white people or Homo sapiens began coming out of Africa and we started going up north where there was snow, it was dark all the time. There's no sun. We didn't need the dark skin anymore. We needed lighter skin so that sun rays could penetrate our skin easier so we could get the vitamin D we needed to live. So there are it's more about geography when it comes to those differences than it has anything to do with the color of people's skin being a race concept.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of, again, the notions of race are very colonized America. So back when Bacon's Rebellion happened, a lot of the white upper class was trying to figure out, how do we not make this happen again? So how do we not get the enslaved Africans and the white indentured servants to pair up? We give the white indentured servants the idea that they have more access to things and are better than enslaved Africans, so that they will be more willing to not give those things up. Of course, nobody wants to go back to the horrible life of being an enslaved person. So they pitted enslaved or indentured white people against enslaved Africans. And the book Fatal Invention, again, I cannot think of the name of the author, but the author wrote that racism created the concept of race and not the other way around. So we needed, and when I say we, I mean the white settlers of America needed a way to keep enslaved Africans in line in the way they wanted to, while keeping their power and privilege. So they created this idea of white indentured servants are better than black enslaved Africans.
And also better than the indigenous
yes.
people who were here as well.
Yep. Yep. So, and again, because as you go out west, like Rick said, Indigenous people were also fighting against the white settlers who were pushing out, and then the indentured servants were also fighting. So having that hierarchy of who's better created racism, which then started to create the concept of race. And after that is when we start seeing um, indigenous people and black people being named by color of their skin or by the race category that settler America made for them in the laws.
Mhm. Yeah, I get it. So it's very interesting to hear that history and the scientific analysis that you were talking about, geography determining certain physical attributes. Now, I also want to mention that I am totally aware of a backlash to this statement, like, oh, there is no such thing as race. I've heard people of color saying that this is a convenient thing for white people to say, oh, of course, there's no such thing as race. But being a black person and walking into a a shopping market or something, and then being followed by the security guards because of the color of their skin, for them, for some of them, they feel like, of course, there are different races. This is how society treats us. So it's just a convenient thing for white people to say, oh, there's no such thing as race. So I just want to bring that in as a, it's also what a part of the dynamics that we're dealing with. What do you think?
Yep. And of course, I can't talk for BIPOC people. And if you don't know what BIPOC has meant, it's Black, Indigenous people of color. And the reason for using that instead of just POC is to acknowledge the unique fights and issues and histories of Black and Indigenous people that has differed from people of color. Um, but yeah, so I can't talk for BIPOC people about how they feel about races. But on the white side, of course, white people aren't taught how to be appropriate allies because we're not taught history or anything of these communities. And while there is definitely it's easier for me to be colorblind ideology, there's a lot of people just not understanding that being colorblind or pretending to be colorblind is actually harmful to these communities. And while race isn't really good for anyone, it affects white people too, even though they don't think it does. Um, like I said, although it is a societal construct, it has consequences, and we need to acknowledge that it exists. If we just pretend that race doesn't exist, we are discounting these lived experiences of these communities. So if we say, oh, I don't see color, then you're discounting the person going into the convenience store and being followed. Um, the hundreds of Black men who are being murdered just for existing by cops because someone sees a Black person and thinks something's wrong. And it is important to appropriately acknowledge that the concept of race exists and there are serious consequences for people who are not white, and that pretending that there isn't color and this doesn't exist is causing more harm to these communities.
Exactly. So as we kind of wind up, do you want to give a little preview of the 11 Days of Global Unity Summit panel on human rights that you and I will be hosting? It'll be coming up in about an hour from now, 1 p.m. Eastern time today. And of course, people can see it on the recording as well. But what are you, what's going to be happening on that panel?
Yep. So we're going to have some guests who are indigenous and work with different indigenous communities to be able to give them a platform to talk about their local issues and fights of their personal indigenous communities. Like I was mentioning earlier, that society really tries to take each community and pretend that their experiences are all the same. So I'm hoping that later on today we can hear how, although Indigenous issues, there are overlapping and issues that Indigenous people face as a whole. There are hundreds of thousands of different Indigenous communities around the world. And in the United States, there are 574 federally recognized tribes, but there are way more than that existing and have existed in the past. And it's important to understand and again hear the personal experiences of Indigenous people in different areas and what's going on for them. So up in Minnesota, the Indigenous people in Canada and North America are fighting the Pipeline 3 pipeline being built by Enbridge. And an offset and consequence of that is missing and murdered Indigenous relatives and that epidemic. But in other areas, people, of course, are fighting other issues. And although they're fighting missing and murdered Indigenous relatives and poor health care, they might have different issues just due to geography and what's going on there. So in the Southwest, they are fighting for different monuments in national parks. They're fighting for Bears Ears, which is a stone structure in one of the national parks, and trying to keep that safe. So preserving culture and identity and resources, something Indigenous people all over the world are fighting for, but hearing what is specifically happening in different locations and how you could potentially help. Again, you don't have to always help people. There is no need to be the white savior all the time, but it's still important to be educated that these things are happening and acknowledging them and acknowledging that media is not covering it. I know I'm helping with some of the pipeline work on Line 3, and a lot of media aren't covering it or talking about it whatsoever. And it's not only going to affect the Indigenous folks there, it's going to affect lots of people. The pipeline could really harm the Mississippi River, and that goes to a lot of people. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later on.
Okay, that sounds great. So this has been wonderful getting to know you, Callum Cintron, and all of these tribute sessions are so wonderful. We really get to meet everybody who's working on these campaigns. And then the 1 p.m. Eastern sessions are when we dig into the subjects in a deep way with people who are on the ground working on all of these 11 campaign areas, and human rights later. We'll be doing that later. So once again, I'd like to say thank you, and you can find out about all of the 11 days sessions, all of the events and the partners working with 11 Days of Global Unity and We the World by going to we.net. And Jim, why don't you close us out? So we'll have Jim bookends, front and back. Jim Garrison.
Thank you, Rick. And thank you, Callum. I think this has been a particularly thoughtful and illuminating session today because you're so right to point out the whole LGBTQ community is under assault in terms of human rights, indigenous people at the hands of colonialism, now 4 or 5 centuries strong around the world, under assault, particularly pointing out, the pipeline. The Biden administration talks the talk about climate change, but doesn't walk the walk, and is letting critical pipelines go through as if it's business as usual. So I just want to acknowledge you bringing it up. And I think just to round off my opening remarks about 9/11 and now rising authoritarianism again with COVID, I think it's particularly important for us to bear in mind that a strategic part of this rising authoritarianism is now targeting the right of women over their own bodies. As we all know from just last week, the state of Texas has now essentially made abortion illegal and is actually putting a bounty, a $10,000 bounty on not only the women, but anybody who helps women, so that perfect strangers can sue in court for damages. And if they win, they get a $10,000 bounty from the state of Texas for stopping a woman and any of her accomplices from dealing with the freedom over her own body. So whether it's our cell phones and emails and our communications, whether it's our LGBTQ friends and colleagues, whether it's women, whether it's indigenous people, human rights are systematically under assault in the world today. And it may be the single greatest concern that we have, almost, I would say, Rick, of any of the issues that we're dealing with, of the 11 issues, because if you don't have freedom, which will be the subject tomorrow, if you don't have basic freedoms, you can't deal with these other issues. If every time you go out into the streets to protest, it's considered a felony and you go to prison for 5 or 10 years, that stultifies the freedom of expression in the public domain. If you can't vote, particularly if you're a person of color or you're a young people, by design, that stultifies the freedom of expression. And so that's why I wanted to end, as I began, to say that that human rights and freedom of expression and assembly is at the heart of democracy. And it's the cornerstone, because if those fundamental rights are not preserved, you don't have the capacity to deal with the other critical issues like climate change. So we really need to take this in a very fundamental, important way. So Callum, I just want to salute you, man. And I also want to say Callum has been a total champ as we've been preparing all these sessions. He answers his emails, in an instant. He's been efficient and comprehensively intelligent and aware. So Callum, I just want to salute you, my friend, on a Saturday morning, and thank you for everything that you're doing. And you've raised real issues for us to contemplate as we enter into the 8th day of the 11th day. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. The after chat group is ready if you want to participate. You'll see the chat in the chat box. And then there's a second session at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for those of you who want Humanity Rising 2 during these 11 days. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you here again tomorrow for the 9th day on freedom with 11 days of global unity. Bye for now. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Callum.